It was the winter of 2002 when I was first invited to dive deep into the world of middle schoolers and serve as their pastor. I was interning in family ministry when the middle school pastor left and the church asked if I could take over. I was also a full-time seminary student and the church had 300 middle schoolers, so I politely declined. But they wouldn't take no for an answer. So I offered to just teach their middle school class on Sundays, and that was supposed to be it. Except they didn't hire anyone else. Sunday teaching expanded to include student leadership training, volunteer meetings, and events. It was nuts. I realized most sane people would have at best done a semester of that craziness and then run away. But I guess I'm not sane because instead of wanting less, I wanted more. I saw so much potential in those students. It was clear that that time in their life was so significant and God could do so much with it that I wanted to be a part of. So after that semester, I signed on full-time and have yet to stop working with middle schoolers in some capacity ever since. Then, in 2018, I got to dive into the middle school world even deeper with my oldest daughter became a middle schooler, followed by her sister 2 years later, with a brother following closely behind that. After years of trying to convince other parents of all the joys of the middle school years, I suddenly had to convince myself of them in a whole new way. I used to regularly come home from middle school mission trips and tell parents about all the ways God had worked in and through their child. But in the middle of sharing, multiple parents would often stop me to make sure that I was talking about their child because the kid I was describing didn't sound like the kid that they lived with at all. I would assure them that I had the right child and come away wondering why the parent couldn't see how amazing their teen was. But now I get it. Living with middle schoolers is way different than being with them on a mission trip, at a retreat, or hanging out at youth group. And yet, I still contend that middle school is not only one of the most critical times in the life of our children, it's also one of the greatest, both in terms of what God can do in them and in us. So, welcome to Milestone 8, the church. This milestone is meant to help you as parents spiritually and relationally guide your kids into and through the teenage years. It goes along with a class we teach to incoming 6th graders to help them understand the role they can play in the church as God is maturing them and inviting them to know Him even more. The material I'm about to share with you is adapted from a course I took early on in ministry to help me understand adolescence. I've updated it many times as I've applied it to ministry and then taught it to over 100 parents and leaders since. Not only have many of them shared how valuable it was in changing their perspective on the teenage years, but I myself have now found it key to help me laugh and empathize instead of cry or throw things when my kids go berserk in the ways we'll name shortly. So let's dive in together to understand more about what is going on during the teenage years and the opportunities that exist for them and us to grow spiritually and relationally during them. And for those of you who are note takers, I do have an outline of this content in our resources for this milestone, so you can grab those if you'd like. We'll start with the larger concept of adolescence. Adolescence was originally identified in 1904 by G. Stanley Hall as a short transition period of storm and stress between childhood and adulthood. Hall identified 3 tasks of adolescence that remain relatively true today as recent researchers name the 3 questions teens continue to ask. Number 1, who am I? The identity question. Number 2, where do I fit in? The belonging question. And number 3, what difference can I make? The purpose question. Here's a key difference though. When Hall first named these tasks, he saw them being accomplished in about 18 months. By the 1970s, adolescence had expanded to be something that started around 13 and ended around 17 or 18. But today, due to a variety of biological, sociological, and economic factors, adolescence has become a full-on life stage that starts as early as 10 and goes well into the mid or even late 20s. To make better sense of this much longer phase of life, 3 stages have now been identified. Early adolescence, the middle school years, middle adolescence, the high school years, and late adolescence or emerging adulthood, which is college and beyond. For our purposes, we'll target early adolescence, but plenty of what we name will continue through at least middle adolescence as well. Early adolescence is a period when things are fairly black and white still, but some gray starts creeping in. Do you like me could be the biggest question that regularly runs through their head because relationally they're desperate for acceptance. That means that more love and affirmation are needed during these years than at any other time. And yet, the middle school years are notorious for being the least lovable and affirmable years of our lives. So you can see why we need to debunk a dangerous parenting fallacy that creeps in during the adolescent years. In the midst of those terrible teenage tantrums, throwing up our hands and thinking or saying, "I've done all I can," is not only unhelpful, it's untrue. In fact, the truth is the opposite. Despite how counterintuitive it is, during the teenage years, more, not less parenting is needed. It just looks different. Let me explain by giving you an image for your mind. This is the Heisman Trophy, an award given to the most outstanding college football player each year. But the sculpture is also a perfect depiction of what we're likely to experience with our teens. The most prominent feature is the stiff arm hand, which teens often give us as they wrestle through their questions around identity, belonging, and purpose. But the most important feature is actually the hand holding the football. Imagine that despite having one hand out prominently pushing us away as they run the other direction, the other hand is actually beckoning and even pleading with us to keep drawing near. It's a plea for love, even though they feel so unlovable. It's a call for affirmation, even though they fail regularly. And it's a cry for acceptance, even though they can hardly accept themselves. Yeah, it's quite the mixed message, but welcome to the mixed up mess going on in your teenager's life. One teen told her youth pastor that after years of pushing her dad away, he finally complied and left her alone. And she was so sad that he did. When our kids are born, we have 936 weeks until they graduate high school. When they begin 6th grade, we're down to just 364 weeks left. That last third can be tough, but so critical. So what does it look like to keep drawing near to our kids during the teenage years? Well, let's look at 6 cognitive and spiritual changes that happen during adolescence that can feel like a stiff arm, but actually open up opportunities for us and them to grow closer to God and each other. Number 1, the shift from concrete to abstract thinking. This initial shift allows teens to start thinking underneath things more and reason through their feelings better. I regularly love hearing 7th grade small group leaders come back after the summer and marvel at how improved their small group leading skills seem to have become. With 6th graders, they mainly just deal with fart jokes and a random distraction like a cat walking into the room, which happened once, means that the kids are completely gone the rest of the night. But over the summer, as kids' brains develop the ability to think more abstractly, deeper conversation becomes more possible. And volunteers love feeling like they're suddenly much more proficient at leading their group. One 7th grade leader enjoyed hearing his group recognize that comparing themselves to others is something they do all the time. Now, they couldn't offer many solutions to fixing that problem, but that light bulb revelation was the beginning of a great conversation rooted in some abstract thinking. I also loved hearing a freshman girl talk about how much better the worship and sermons were getting at High Rock. We had apparently finally gotten our act together and made things accessible to her in a way that she was really enjoying, whereas previously things were kind of boring and over her head. Now, the stiff arm here is that things are no longer black and white, and we all know that gray areas make life more complex. But the opportunity to draw closer and help them develop spiritually is that they can now engage in some deeper spiritual questions. So rather than just telling them the facts, you can ask, "I wonder what you think," or "I wonder what you feel" kinds of questions to draw out their new abilities. For years, a regular dinner practice in our house has been to go around and share highs and lows. That's still a great practice we do even in high school and adult small groups too. But as our kids got older, we decided to mix things up and tackle some deeper dinner discussions. So we brainstormed a list of topics we all thought would be interesting, such as technology, sex, racism, money, healthy habits, and a variety of faith questions. Then each Thursday, we'll pick one to discuss. I'll usually get things started with a few of my own struggles or questions about the topics, and then I'll try to treat my kids like adults and give them space to share their thoughts and ideas while my wife Heather and I will toss in additional questions or stories from our lives. It can be a bit chaotic and some are better than others at it, but we know our kids' brains are shifting, so we want to create space for new spiritual conversations, not lectures, just to be clear, that help us all grow. And to help your family engage in some of these conversations, I put some resources on our webpage for this milestone, including a fairly robust guide to talking about sex and dating, which can be a nerve-wracking topic to tackle, but doesn't have to be. And inviting these types of conversations also fits nicely with a second shift that happens in adolescence. Number 2, idealism and criticalness kick in. Our teens' newly acquired abstract thinking abilities allow them to imagine a perfect world, a perfect family, and a perfect person. This, of course, allows them to see the shortfalls of their own world, family, and person, and voila, we have the recipe for what can seem like a never-ending barrage of critique and argumentative statements or tirades that are all part of their growing process. This one might feel like the hardest stiff arm, especially as it collides with us parents, hitting midlife questions and crises that lead to plenty of our own insecurities around imperfections and failures. There are two rich invitations here, though. First, we get to learn patience and humility as we keep loving our overly critical teens and seek to even learn from some of their new insights. God could even use their voice to call out our idols and hypocrisy that we've been trapped by for years. And second, we get to engage them in making the world around them better, recognizing that so many major movements in history have started with idealistic, critical adolescents, like Jesus' disciples, who were likely mostly teenagers. So as a youth pastor, I tried to create a culture where students could give feedback freely. Middle schoolers would tell me that my carefully thought out, brilliantly reasoned messages were too long. High schoolers made fun of my amazing dancing skills, rightly so. And going deeper, I remember talking to an intern about her struggles with seeing so many peers and adults at our church falling short of the ideals that she saw in Scripture. It was a hard conversation, but honest and accurate, which is what I want to cultivate space for at church and at home. So a couple times a year, I'll take my kids on a date, do something that they enjoy, and at some point in the conversation, I'll ask two questions. What's something you love about our family? And what's something you wish could change in our family? Sometimes they directly target me, other times they talk about other relational dynamics, and sometimes they have no responses. The bottom line is creating a space where they get to productively engage their criticalness and idealism. You can also avoid some arguments by preemptively engaging teens' critical thinking through joint problem solving. A cell phone contract might be a good example here. All forms of screen time are an argument waiting to happen, right? So before you even give a teen a cell phone, establish boundaries with a contract. I've included a sample in the resource section to get you started, but don't just slap a bunch of rules on them. Work together to determine what kind of contract you both could feel good about, allowing them to channel their critical thinking toward a productive plan. Of course, a big reason they are so critical toward us and others is because they're desperately trying to handle number 3, self-consciousness to the max. Due to a growing self-awareness of the changes happening in their bodies, looks, feelings, emotions, intelligence, and spirituality, newsflash, teens become self-centered. I remember talking to my spiritual director about issues we were having with one of our adolescents, calling the child the most selfish person on the planet. Definitely a reaction to the stiff arm I was getting nailed with by that teen. But he quickly reminded me of how unhelpful that type of narrative was. Yes, teens will blow you away with their self-centered language and behavior, and it will trigger us. The opportunity is not grumbling, though, it's grace. I remember one student telling me how she literally felt that everyone was watching her. As youth leaders, we were able to joke with her about the scientific impossibilities of that happening, while also offering grace-filled empathy as we understood what a heavy weight that would be to carry. Psychologists call this invitation to grace-filled empathy validation versus condemnation. Validation doesn't require approval or agreement necessarily, but simply focuses on seeing things from their perspective. Rather than demanding they change to be acceptable, you focus on letting them know you're with them. Theologians would call this type of grace-filled empathy the incarnation, where Jesus came down to an undeserving, self-centered world as Emmanuel, God with us. And as a family pastor and parent, I love to practice incarnational ministry, which seeks to follow Jesus' model in sticking with kids and teens, regardless of how messy they become, and bringing God's love and truth to them through our Christ-centered relationship. And speaking of messy, let's talk about decision-making. A fourth impact of all the changes happening in our teens' brains is that decisions are a disaster. You might be familiar with the concept of knowing just enough to be dangerous. Teens struggle in that space daily thanks to their improved cognitive awareness that enables them to see so many new facets of life. But when a decision needs to be made, they don't yet have the ability to filter through all the new possibilities and considerations that suddenly confront them. So having a choice, or worse, multiple choices to make, feels threatening. The future can be overwhelming as a whole because they don't really know themselves well enough yet to decide what they want. Their indecision and defiance might be maddening to us, but for them, not deciding or refusing is about keeping possibilities open and maintaining their beloved sense of freedom. So, what can we do when they stiff-arm us with various forms of I don't know and no? Let me suggest a possible three-step process. First, embrace their indecisiveness and/or defiance as a chance to remember what you value and why. Second, draw out their thoughts as best you can to understand their struggle. And third, partner with them in making decisions that set them up to love God and others well. Now, let's apply this process to two common battlegrounds, school and then church. When our teen wakes up and says, "Why do I have to go to school today? I just want to stay home," we could be tempted to laugh or scream. But first consider why you value education. Ideally, it's not about just pushing your kids to achieve so you look good and they find a lucrative career. If so, maybe their pushback is justified, and we need to take it as an invitation to remember that school can be so much more than that. School is a privilege we receive humbly as an opportunity to understand God's creation, grow in a relationship with others, and explore His purposes for our lives. With that in mind, be curious about why they don't want to go to school. Draw out their thoughts. Are they just riding the roller coaster of their hormones and emotions? Or is there something deeper going on that they need support in sorting through? We've uncovered situations with some pretty awful teachers and bullies at times. And in other instances, we've discovered the child was stressing too much about school and needed help dealing with anxiety. And finally, partnering with them might involve working together to determine a better schedule, routine, or even school that helps them thrive. Or it could mean you kindly just take the decision off the table, helping them to get over themselves and do what you, as their parent, knows is best, even though they're struggling in that moment. Now, how might this process apply to the teen who can't decide if they feel like going to youth group or flat out refuses to go to church? Again, start by receiving their pushback as an invitation to remember why you value church. Is it just something you do when you feel like it? Or is it just something you do because that's what good Christians do? Research has shown that when it comes to church participation, involvement in intergenerational worship is the closest thing to a silver bullet for developing lasting faith in teens. So I know many families who make the hard choice to forego other activities and sports in order to prioritize regular participation in all church worship services. But why would we do that? What is it about gathering with other Christians who are older, younger, and different from us that builds a vibrant faith? Jesus seemed to think the church was so important, He died to bring it to life. But if we haven't thought about our own reasons for church participation or lack thereof, our teens' pushback could be the push that we need. As we remember our own values around church, we can then draw out our teens when their faith seems fickle. Pastor Dave has shared that when his kids push back at him about going to youth group, he says he is all ears about what their concern is, and he invites them to share about it in the car on the way to youth group. He does listen though, and when their issues are valid, I've seen him do one of two things. Either he passes their concerns on to me and other youth leaders to help us help them, or he works with the teen to discern a creative alternative, such as having the teen read and discuss an edifying book with him. The main point is that we value our teens' spiritual formation. We want them to know it's a priority. Students may push back on going to youth group, but I would suggest working with them to commit to at least trying it for a year and diving in fully to retreats, especially since that's where so much bonding happens. But non-negotiables can actually help relieve teens of decision-making and even allow them to throw us under the bus with peers who pressure them to do other things. It's okay if we have to be the bad guy sometimes. But if a student's temperament or other factors make youth group untenable, the goal is not to be dogmatic about youth group. Instead, be creative in expressing the value of prioritizing faith formation, working with them to decide how best to pursue that. Now, to be clear, just going to church or youth group isn't the ultimate goal, right? Prioritizing those experiences is just a starting point for living out the two greatest priorities, or commandments as Jesus calls them. Loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves is what we're really wanting to drive all our decisions. So as we work with our teens and the million other decisions that they have to sort through, share your own decision-making process for how you prioritize God and others and what you do to help set them up for their decisions. And then, if, or actually when, they fail to make wise decisions or any decisions, be available to debrief the process and extend lots of grace to help them keep trying again. Now, when you put the first 4 changes together, you get a 5th dynamic called apparent hypocrisy. Apparent hypocrisy results from teens having a new sense of ideals that they even express passionately at times, but fail to live out in practice. What looks like hypocrisy, however, is more a result of them not yet recognizing the difference between expressing an ideal and working toward it. A way you might see the disconnect between expressing and living out ideals is through the candles in a window phenomenon. Teens can be quite adept at turning on whatever candle they need depending on the room or social setting that they're in. So at school they might be one person, at home another, at church a third, and with their best friend down the street a fourth. To us, their apparent hypocrisy might feel like the stiff arm that breaks the camel's back. They can seem so disingenuous and deceitful that we want to dismiss them entirely. But for them, it's just about survival. They're drowning in changes, challenges, and pressure to perform on so many fronts. Being a chameleon makes it all possible for them, even if they have to shortchange some of their ideals, particularly ones related to their faith. So we have the opportunity to help them in at least one major way here by engaging them in serving. Research on teenage faith development has found that serving is significantly correlated to lasting faith. Generation Z, the generation born after 1997, is extremely justice-oriented and wants their lives to matter. One study found that graduating seniors wished for more mission trips and service projects than games at youth group. A 7th grade boy might not have quite gotten to the same opinion yet, but that generation is more socially conscious than any other current one, which is a great thing, especially as a productive way to deal with their apparent hypocrisy. Serving moves students from just talking the talk to actually walking the walk. Knowing their self-centeredness can easily trip up their justice ideals, the Swain family has often sat down with each of their teens at the beginning of the school year and had them pick a ministry they wanted to serve in. They set parameters that push them to walk the walk while also respecting their autonomy and nurturing their sense of identity by giving them freedom and guidance to choose. Some work with Kids Rock, some do middle school ministry, some choose the welcome team, some serve in the kitchen, and others have worked with children who have special needs. And their family certainly isn't alone. We have middle schoolers and high schoolers serving all over the place at High Rock, and that is very intentional. We believe one of our greatest callings as a church is to mobilize the next generation and turn over the keys for them to try out their ideals, fail, and learn more about integrating their faith and expanding God's kingdom. So help them find their niche and watch them do amazing things for Christ. Finally, number 6 is the need for a big God. Youth are working toward making their faith their own. To do so, they now need a bigger God that goes beyond easy answers, rote rituals, and simple solutions. Many studies have been done and continue to be done on teens and religion. At best, the data suggests that about 50% of kids who attend youth group in high school stick with their faith. That's a coin flip. I'm not comfortable with that statistic, but I get it. Only dropping our kids off at church to outsource their spiritual formation just isn't enough. There are too many other counter-influences in our teens' lives to imagine that just a couple hours a week at church is enough to shape their identity around Christ rather than culture. But another study found that 82% of teens whose parents are intentional in talking about and practicing faith at home follow Jesus as adults. Christian Smith, a sociologist at Notre Dame who conducted this study, writes, "Parents, for better or worse, are actually the most influential pastors of their children. Parents set a glass ceiling of religious commitment above which their children rarely rise." So as much as I stand by what I've suggested so far in prioritizing other intergenerational relationships at church, We as parents are the most influential disciplers in our kids' lives, but that might sound scary. The finding that parents' faith commitment sets a ceiling on our kids' faith commitment could be paralyzing. I know my faith has much to be desired, and I'm a pastor. It's my job to be a good Christian. Yet my shortcomings are manifold, and I know all of us feel that way as parents and followers of Christ at times as well. But instead of paralyzing us, what if this finding galvanizes us in at least two ways? First, with God, it's never too late. One of the benefits of our teens watching and critiquing our every move could be having them see us step up our own pursuit of Christ. At the beginning, I suggested that during the teenage years, more, not less parenting is needed. But it takes different forms. Modeling a more vibrant walk with Christ could be one of the most significant. Don't inundate them with Bible bashing, but be real about your faith journey and ways you're pursuing God, even if you're just getting started again or for the first time. I know one parent recently invited her daughter to join her each morning to listen to the High Rock Daily Devotions. And that's been a big win for their relationship with God and each other. You can also get involved in serving and doing that together with them even. Some families have taken their teens on mission trips. Others have helped them set up nonprofits to address needs their teen is passionate about. And another family likes to serve the homeless together once a month. The need for a big God in your teen's life can be an invitation for God to be a bigger part of yours. Second, share your failures. When my kids were younger, they loved hearing me tell stories of when I got hurt or got in trouble. I feared they were rather sadistic as they took delight in all my pain. But I eventually realized they were just trying to find hope and meaning in their own pain. So I've told them the lying about getting marked around the carpet story and the breaking 2 arms and a thumb riding down a hill on a skateboard story a bajillion times. But I also saved a bunch of PG-13 or worse stories for when they were older, knowing as teens they would need even more perspective on how God can redeem sin, struggle, and doubt. I've now started opening up that story cache at various points when relevant moments occur to help them hear how God's forgiveness and healing have been significant in my life. Some of these stories are from the past, but naming ways I sin, doubt, and seek forgiveness on a daily basis can be just as powerful. You know, our culture tempts us and our teens to pursue easy answers and easy lives. But what we both really need is a big God who calls us to serve Him in big ways with the big church community. There was a book I read when I was just starting out as a youth pastor called Practicing Passion: Youth and the Quest for a Passionate Church. The book inspired me then and now to lean into all the changes I've mentioned and receive them as the rich opportunities I've highlighted. One of the main points the book made was that teens are like heat-seeking missiles, drawn to fire, yearning for people and experiences that will channel their passion. We can try to douse their flames, or we can embrace them and even allow their fire to reignite our own faith as we seek to fuel theirs. Friends, our good God has good plans for you and your teen during these years. When you get mired in the mayhem, may you remember that He is with you and them, delighting in the possibilities both of you have to know, love, and serve Him more. Amen.